Good evening. My name is Carolina Schott. I'm an air quality permit supervisor with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Thank you for taking the time to come to the presentation portion of the public meeting for the Water Gremlin Major Permit Amendment. Your feedback is very important to us. We will be presenting a lot of technical information. We hope the information presented here helps you better understand the air permit process in general, and in particular, how the Water Gremlin proposed permit was drafted. The agenda topics for today are to provide an overview of the Air Quality Permits Program, to provide a brief description of the air emission sources at Water Gremlin, to explain the technical, regulatory, and ambient air quality impact analysis that was conducted for the proposed permit, to describe the proposed changes to the existing air quality permit, and to answer questions on the proposed permit changes or the process we follow to get here. The ultimate purpose of environmental regulation is protection of human health and the environment. There are state and federal rules that apply everywhere in the country or the state, and to which all regulated activities are subject to. These are considered baseline protections and include maintenance of healthy air to breathe. For this, rules set limits known as ambient air quality standards, and MPCA use a network of ambient monitors across the state to keep tabs on the air quality. We also use available technology to reduce pollutions from specific types of equipment or activities, such as boilers. The rules promulgated under this basis are known as standards of performance. We use environmental management tools, such as permits for air emission facilities. All those listed so far are considered baseline protections. In some situations, however, it is necessary to conduct site-specific analysis that go beyond baseline requirements to protect human health. In these cases, we conduct the site-specific impact analysis to develop more stringent permit requirements than the baseline analysis would result in. We conduct site-specific modeling or site-specific ambient monitoring of pollutants. We look at known air toxics, which are air pollutants for which the Minnesota Department of Health has developed health-based air guidance values and for which there are not ambient air quality standards. State statutes and rules authorize the use of these guidance values to assess potential health risks from air toxics released from specific facilities in a specific area of impact. These site-specific assessments are used to define permit conditions to protect human health. These site-specific limits could be for criteria pollutants as well as for air toxics. Let's take a look at the pollutants that we review when we're looking at a permit and evaluating the application. There are criteria pollutants that are in blue here, and criteria pollutants are those pollutants for which there are national and state ambient air quality standards. These are carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and ozone or smoke. In the case of ozone, we look at volatile organic compounds or VOCs, as these are precursors of ozone. We just described when MPCA evaluates air toxics. It is important to note that the Minnesota air toxics overlap with other pollutants. In some cases, these air toxics could also be particulate matter of different sizes and also could be VOCs. There's another category of pollutants known as hazardous air pollutants or HAPs. This is a federal category of pollutants, and there are specific federal rules for equipment that emits these pollutants. Many HAPs are also part of the Minnesota air toxics. Lead in particular, which is emitted by Water Gremlin, must be highlighted here because lead is a criteria pollutant, but is also a HAP and is also a Minnesota air toxics. There are other pollutants such as greenhouse gases that are also considered in permits. In issuing a permit, we seek to achieve other objectives besides protection of human health and the environment. Facility-specific permits serve as an accountability tool for the permittee, for regulators, and for the public. The air quality permits describe the regulated operations at the facility and also describe the rules and facility-specific limitations that are enforced by the permit. Facility permits are also a compliance tool, as the objective is to help facilities understand and comply with the rules and the permit conditions. There are two main types of permits. One is for operating permits for existing facilities, and the other one type is construction and modification permits, which are required for new or modified facilities. This permit for the water grounding facility is to authorize operation and modification of the facility, as it authorizes several changes that will be discussed later in the presentation. I would also like to explain how we calculate emissions to determine permit requirements. These are set of calculations that vary for each pollutant we regulate and are expressed in tons per year. In the public notice and technical documents supporting the permit, you will see various designations of calculated emissions. So here is an example of how a set of calculations might look like for a pollutant. The first column is the unlimited emissions, which represents emissions released if the equipment were operated nonstop at a full capacity. The second column represents how unlimited emissions are reduced when air quality rules are taken into account. The rules that are considered here are those that apply to the equipment, even if there is no permit for the facility. The first and the second column are used to determine if a facility needs a permit. The third column represents emissions further reduced by means of limitations enforced by a permit, such as additional limits on emissions and/or additional limits on hours of operation and/or limitations on operating rates. This is the set of calculations that you see listed in the public notice. The fourth column represents an example of a typical proportion of actual emissions with respect to the allowable emissions on a given year for a facility with ample margin of compliance. Now about the permit process. This diagram shows the permit process and how the public has participated in it and will continue to do so. It all started with the receipt of an application in October 2018 to modify the water Gremlin facility. We have received multiple updates due to a combination of changes on the scope of the modification as a result of Pollution Control Agency requests for needed information and as a result of the need to expand into a site-specific analysis for the facility. So it has taken us quite a bit to get here. On the other hand, since 2019, the MPCA engaged in regular meetings with stakeholders through the NCCG group. This has been a useful process of public engagement that continues to date. Once we have a preliminary draft permit, we share it with the permittee to ensure clarity and to address remaining questions or material errors. This is an interactive process, and Water Gremlin has seen several versions of the draft permit at different stages and has provided feedback on these drafts. Next comes where we are now, the posting of the permit and opening of the formal public notice period. In this case, MPC knew through communication with stakeholders that a public meeting was needed to improve the sharing of information and to improve public participation, and therefore we are holding this meeting. At the end of the comment period, the MPCA will review and consider the comments that we receive and any requests for contested case hearing, and we will respond to these comments and requests. Finally, staff will make a recommendation for a permit decision. Now, let's look at the types of equipment regulated in the proposed permit for water Gremlin. There are various types of equipment that process lead-containing products. They're melting pots, die cast, abrasive blasting, billet saw, and coining. There are several types of coaters that treat the lead-containing products as needed. There are TDC VOC coaters that could be spray or deep drip. There are water-based coaters that also can be spray or deep drip. There are hybrid coaters that could apply either water or VOC coatings. And there's spray coaters that utilize UV curing. There are various types of combustion sources as well, different kinds of heaters, emergency generators, and even a bake oven. Other emission sources included are a tin melting pot, support operations for the coatings such as solvent distillation and solvent tanks. There are cooling towers, and there are rods that were considered, as well as emissions from the solvent vapor mitigation system. Highlighted here is the equipment that the permit reauthorizes for replacement, modification, and conversion in particular coaters under specific conditions. This is to promote and make it easier to replace TDCE coaters with other coaters that emit lower amounts of pollution. Space heaters can be replaced under specific permit conditions as part of the normal upkeep at the plant. We need to explain the scope of the technical and regulatory analysis conducted by MPCA for the proposed permit. This review is used to evaluate emissions and decide on permit limits and other conditions. This is a list of the various aspects of the review as compared to the 2006 permit. The scope of the analysis done for the proposed permit was much more broader as we had much more information for the facility. In 2006, the permit review was a baseline review, as it was described earlier, as we had much less information. Basically, we just had calculations and some stack testing data. The review of the draft permit has improved in several ways as follows. We implemented the mandates in the TCE ban legislation. We conducted site-specific dispersion modeling for compliance with ambient air quality standards for particulates, nitrogen oxides, and lead. We conducted dispersion modeling and air toxics analysis, taking into account all air toxics emissions from water Gremlin and from nearby facilities. We reviewed more than 3 years of measured ambient air concentrations of TDCE, lead, and other pollutants around water Gremlin, as well as reviewed the records of the associated TDCE solvent usage at the facility. We review new stack test data and requested additional emission testing as part of the application review. The tests that were conducted were for UV coaters, and we review existing testing data for some lead processing equipment. We review more than 2 years of measured emissions data from a continuous emission monitor at the coating stack. We reviewed 2 years of measured indoor air emissions, or TDCE, that was collected as part of the vapor intrusion evaluation. We also reviewed 2 years of measurements of stacked emissions from the mitigation system. As a result of our technical and regulatory analysis of all the available information, we defined permit emission limits. This table summarizes the basis for the various limits for the various pollutants. Where more than one limit exists, these become overlapping requirements and are individually enforced. There are limits based on standards of performance for specific equipment for several pollutants. They're listed on the second column here. There are also limits based on regulatory caps that Water Gremlin has voluntarily assumed to avoid regulation on the federal permit limits and certain federal standards of performance. This is allowed by state and federal rules, and the resulting reductions in allowable emissions is enforced by the permit, and they are shown, the pollutants for which we have emission caps are shown here. The second and the third column in light colors describe limits that are part of the baseline review, as we described before. The last column, highlighted, shows the emission limits that are based on our site-specific ambient air quality impact analysis supporting the permit. All the pollutants, in one way or another, have limitations in the permit. This table, with a lot of numbers, shows the specific emission calculation profiles for water Gremlin. This column, these are the pollutants. Second column shows what will be the emissions based on the installed capacity. The third column shows what the proposed draft permit proposes as limits for the facility for all the different pollutants. These are the numbers that you will see in the technical support document for the permit, the unlimited potential emissions and the permitted limited emissions. The highlighted pollutants in blue show where the proposed permit will enforce significant reductions over what the facility could potentially emit if no restrictions were in place. These are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude reductions. For the most part, these significant reductions are based on the results of the site-specific analysis of impacts conducted as part of this permit process. All of these identified emission reductions need to be incorporated into the permit. In order to be an effective accountability and compliance tool, the content of an air permit includes the following: a facility description identifying the regular activities and equipment, all the applicable federal regulations, state rules and statutes, the applicable emission limits, operating requirements, and various types of compliance demonstrations, such as emission testing, monitoring and parameter verification of emissions and operating parameters, record keeping of calculated emissions, compliance parameters and deviations, and reporting of compliance status and deviations. From this point on, we will describe in more detail the content of the proposed permit and highlight important improvements over the current permit. So you have a column with the 2006 general features and a column that describes in more detail the proposed permit. The text in white depicts aspects of the permit which are broader in scope or stricter or both. Starting with the permit term, the proposed permit expires in 5 years instead of a non-expiring permit that is the current situation. The proposed permit includes many more emission sources that have been described by now as compared to only 2 types of emission sources in the existing permit. As mentioned before, the technical and regulatory review for the proposed permit includes a more extensive evaluation of criteria pollutants and adds lead to that evaluation. Likewise, the evaluation of HAPs and air toxics is more extensive than for the current permit. There was no air toxics review here. It was TCE and evaluation of HAPs as a baseline assessment from the strictly regulatory standpoint. There was no air toxics evaluation. The proposed permit includes more stringent emission limits than the 2006 permit for most criteria pollutants, as well as for HAPs and identified toxics. These limits were based on the site-specific analysis of air impacts, and we used dispersion modeling, air toxics assessment, and also the measure ambient air concentrations of the pollutants under assessment. These limits go beyond what will be required to comply with only a baseline review. By contrast, the 2006 permit, application, and technical review did not include any site-specific analysis. In order to meet the more stringent emission limits, the proposed draft permit requires the installation of new control equipment to limit emissions of particulate matter from the spray coaters, particulate matter from the lead processing equipment, and lead from the lead processing equipment. The proposed permit requires more stringent control efficiencies and improved practices to ensure the proper operation of control equipment. The proposed permit also includes improved conditions to ensure the control equipment is replaced without delay and continues to meet the permit requirements. The draft permit included more stringent operating requirements and limitations and expanded the number of equipment and activities that are covered by the permit. These limitations in the collective ensure that conditions of mitigation of air impacts are defined and enforceable, and ensure the operation assumptions made in the site-specific ambient air quality analysis remain in place. So in this manner, the permit requires improved limitations over those in the 2006 permit. We have improved operation requirements for the coating room under negative pressure. We have specific material handling requirements to mitigate evaporation losses and fugitives. We include in the permit the operation of the indoor vapor mitigation system that is regulated by the remediation division. We implement the TCE band. We limit the amount and type of VOCs that can be used in the coaters. We limit expansion of TDCE VOC coaters. We have limits on processing rates of lead processing equipment, limits on the operation of combustion sources, improve operation and maintenance requirements for the coaters, requirements to operate control equipment for more sources, and we prohibit the use of listed HAPs in coaters as prescribed in federal rules. We mentioned before MPCA conducted site-specific ambient air quality analysis assessments, and we mentioned that the permit reauthorizes limited replacement and conversion of existing coaters and limited installation of new coaters. In addition, Water Gremlin may need to make other changes at the facility that could increase pollution or incorporate new pollutants of concern during the life of the permit. In order to ensure the ambient air impacts of these future changes are addressed, the permit requires the facility to maintain the assumed modeling characteristics, also restrict the public access. It also requires updated modeling and air toxics assessment for facility changes that do not conform with the assumptions made for the site-specific analysis in support of the permit. Finally, in order to make sure that all worked as assumed and predicted by the modeling and air toxics analysis, the permit requires continuation of ambient air quality monitoring of VOCs and TDCE around the facility. The permit also includes expanded and improved measurement of emissions via testing to verify compliance with more stringent emission limits. The testing information is also improved by defining test plan requirements in the permit. There are improvements on the measurements and records of minimum negative pressure drop in the coating room to ensure that the emissions are directed to the stack for optimal dispersion as it was assumed in the modeling. If the permittee wishes to change how to calculate emissions, it is required to test to verify these changes. Permit includes conditions for the proper operation of the indoor vapor mitigation system that is under oversight of our remediation group. Lastly, the permit includes improved conditions for the monitoring of parameters and operation of control equipment. And the permit record keeping requirements are also more stringent in that they require more frequent and extensive records of compliance parameters, such as pressure drop in the coating room. It requires daily records of coating usage, of TDCE solvent usage, TDCE recovered, TDCE reused, and TDCE disposed in waste, as opposed to just monthly records of purchase of VOC containing materials in the current permit. New in the draft permit are daily records of lead processing material, as well as daily records of calculations to show compliance with emission rates that were assumed in the modeling and air toxics assessments for TDCE, particulate matter, and lead. There are also improved monthly verification of VOCs and HAP emissions. The permit requires more detailed records on the installation of all pre-authorized equipment. The permit requires more strict and expanded reporting. All reports need to be certified. We will get more complete stack test reports. There are new reports on the condition of the coating room that are used to apply TDC coatings, and more frequent reporting on changes in the coaters. There are monthly reports of TDCA solvent usage on stack continuous emission monitoring results. There are monthly reports of TDCE and VOC ambient monitoring results. There are reports of audits of TDCE purchases and inventory to verify operator usage records, and we will talk a little more in the next slide. There are annual reports summarizing the changes at the facility that affect the assumptions that were made in the composition and amount of pollutants and that they were subject to modeling and air toxics analysis. There are annual reports on VOC emissions to evaluate the changes in VOCs other than those from TDC emissions. There's a requirement for a commercial disclosure of emissions into the community, a requirement for an annual meeting. This annual meeting is to report to the community operation changes that affect emissions into the community and to report on compliance status. Lastly, until the stipulation agreement and the administrative orders are terminated, the permit requires continuation of all reports mandated by these enforcement documents. An additional verification of daily operator records of TTC solvent usage, as we expect the usage level might be close to the limit. This is accomplished by the use of other measurements that are collected independently from the operator records in the coating room. This can be considered as a type of quality control check on daily records in the coating room. This secondary verification was not included in 2006 permit. There are two verifications that are used and that use measure emissions from one is use of CEM measure emissions. The continuous emission monitor CEM is installed in the coating room, and the other verification method is from a quarterly audit of TDC purchases and inventory records. If operator usage records are not in alignment with any of these other verification steps, the permittee is required to review daily operator record keeping processes, to correct as needed, and to report on findings. This completes the description of the proposed permit. If you would like to submit written comments on the content of the draft permit, the deadline is 4:30 on August 20th. That means that we have to have the comments postmarked by August 20 we use mail or received electronically by August 20th at 4:30. There are two options to submit comments, regular mail or electronic submittal online. The public notice and draft materials are available on our notice website. Our MPCA website also includes guidance on how to comment on permits. These comments need to be specific, including portions of the permit and proposed action to be taken. This is how the posting of the notice and permit documents looks like. You have link for the notice, comment period, and you have links to the draft permit itself and to the technical support document and attachments to the technical support document. The comment button gives you access to the online comment portal. This completes our description of the permit conditions and permit process. We hope this helps you in the understanding of how this permit protects human health and the environment and how it changes the current permit.